Hello everybody, my name is Kyle Forster and today I'm going to be discussing the controversial topic known as climate change or global warming. Now there's two sides to this argument. There is the skeptical side and there are the believers. Now a believer that many people must know is Al Gore, because when he released his documentary The Inconvenient Truth, he's talked a lot about global warming, what it's going to do, and what it's already done. A lot of the skeptics saw this as scare tactics and exaggerations that were used to try to get his point across. And that may not necessarily be true, but Al Gore does use very correct sources and scientific evidence that checks out. Now, one argument that skeptics seem to make is that the temperatures currently are not at any critical state. And while yes, this is true, and yes, the temperatures do seem to reach a plateau sort, it's because what we are comparing them to is not necessarily fair. In 1998, El Nino was very rampant that year, and that means that it was a very hot year and very warm all around the world. Now, the reason why temperatures seem to be plateauing is because we keep comparing them to the beginning of the decade when El Nino was running rampant. And because this is what we're comparing them to when El Nino is no longer running rampant, temperatures seem to be plateauing, and while a lot of people say, oh, that's normal, these don't account for the El Nino and what it did with the influx of the temperature. Now, another argument that skeptics make is that what we do to record the temperatures is we have surface temperature stations, and those are either located in cities or rural areas. They say that a lot of the information that comes from these stations is not necessarily correct. And while yes, this is correct, because in cities they do tend to trap heat more because of the concrete and the asphalt and the buildings, scientists account for this by taking the evidence that we find in the rural areas and either stating those as the record and documenting those, or finding an average of the rural areas and the city areas that are within the same geographical area and confirming that as being the temperature to go by rather than solely the city, so we don't see an increase in the temperatures when it's not really how the temperature really is. Now, another argument that skeptics seem to make is that satellites are more accurate than these surface temperatures, and the satellites don't point to the same conclusion that we have the surface temperature areas pointing to. While this is correct, it's because when we first started using the satellite, we weren't really sure how to read the evidence. So for the first few years, first few documents, we kind of incorrectly recorded and documented what we thought the temperatures were. But since we have been getting more advanced technology and we have learned how to read the satellites, the temperatures are in correlation with what the surface temperatures are. And so this only helps check out what the surface temperatures are being recorded as. Now, another argument that the skeptics have is that based on a larger timeline of what the Earth has, the temperatures currently are not that different. And while yes, this is true with the evidence that we have, one thing that we must keep in mind is that any evidence that we have of temperatures that date longer than 150 years ago is not necessarily going to be 100% correct, because we only really started to record the temperatures for the past 150 years or so. Anything else that we have is based on clues or hints or evidence from the environment, but this could be completely wrong because we don't have any actual documents stating what the temperatures were. Now, another skeptic argument is that the sea levels have been rising for a while now, and it's not really contributed to global warming. And ever since the Ice Age, the sea levels remained the same until the 1800s. And then from the 1800s to the 1900s, they rose at a very small amount. And then from the 1900s, when carbon dioxide emissions were starting to increase by a significant amount, that's when we saw the sea levels rising a lot higher. Now, sea level also includes the oceans, and this also has to account for the glacial ice caps melting and going into the ocean. And although it's not nearly as drastic as Al Gore makes it seem in his documentary, it is still an issue. Now, with all of this evidence and all of this scientific evidence pointing towards one issue, it still is a controversy, and even though it's not necessarily as drastic as it may seem, it will be drastic within the next 10, 20, 50 years.